Greetings! It has been too long since we last talked. This, of course, is my recap video for the period of the Rishonim, where I talk about things I left out of the videos, correct mistakes that I made in the videos, and answer questions from Gaon and Navi level patrons on Patreon. As always, I offer a warm welcome to everyone who found this channel, most recently through History House Productions, who was very generous to join me on the Poland video. It was kind of a tribute to his work on Poland. But let's just get into it. So the itinerary of Benjamin of Tudela, which I read in its entirety for this video, is surprisingly short. But there are still things I left out, either because I couldn't make sense of them or simply for the sake of narrative pacing. This is entertainment as well as education. But one thing he wrote that really fascinated me is that as he traveled through Greece, and really the impetus for making this video was so I could talk about Greece and Sicily and demographics when there really wasn't enough to give them their own videos, but as he traveled through Greece, and specifically Thessaly, he mentions that there are these raiders in the mountains called Vlachs who occasionally come down into the plains and attack the cities. And as far as I've been able to tell, this is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, surviving mention of the Romanian people. And when I say the Romanian people, it's not just in Romania or Moldova, but there's a scattering of smaller, almost tribal groups all over the Balkans and down into Greece. And this is what he encountered. Even more enticing, I found, was that he mentions that these Vlachs were pagans, because this would have been the last generation of Vlachs to worship the old Roman gods. In the 1180s, Peter from Bulgaria and Asen, who was a Vlach, revolted against Constantinople, formed the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, and that was the final end of Roman paganism. From Benjamin of Tudela's description, he said that the Vlachs did not attack Jewish houses, which says to me that they identified with the Jews as mutual victims of Roman oppression, which very different from the days of pre-Christian Rome. He also said that they had Hebrew names, but I can't really make sense of that. Another interesting thing that he mentions, but sadly he's the only source for this and says very little, is that when he traveled through Cyprus, there was a third school of Judaism which wasn't rabbinic and wasn't Karaite, but was only practiced on that one island and only by a minority of Jews there. He calls them Epicursim, from the Greek Epicurian, but that's just a generic Jewish term for a heretic, so who knows what they called themselves. The only thing he says about them is that they observed Shabbat on Sundays instead of Saturdays, and then neither he nor anyone else ever mentions them again, so we'll never know. So first up for this video, a correction. Maimonides did not come up with evil as being the absence of good rather than a force in its own right. Augustine of Hippo said much the same thing many centuries earlier, and though I didn't look further into it, I wouldn't be surprised if he wasn't the first. But it is true that Thomas Aquinas was influenced by Maimonides' thoughts on this, and he says as much in his commentary on Peter Lombard's 4 Books of Sentences. So some of you were at least surprised, in some cases disappointed, that the image of Maimonides that I chose for this video is not based on the most common portrait of him that you will generally see. If you are in a very devout Jewish environment, you will usually see a portrait of him mounted somewhere that looks like this, what you're seeing on screen right now. The truth is that we don't have any contemporary representations of Maimonides, nor of most of the Jewish figures from this period, so I've had to rely on modern depictions for my artwork. This portrait that you see here is from the 17th century, and I've heard rumors that this might actually have been originally a portrait of someone else entirely, which I try to avoid on principle, but really, I just thought it was goofy looking. The depiction that I used is an alternate depiction of Maimonides, and it's one to which I actually have a personal connection. During the winter break of end of 2012, start of 2013, I went on a trip through Spain with my mom, which included a trip to Cordoba, where there is a bronze statue of Maimonides, which is what this is based on. And she was really excited to find it because she had learned all about him in the university. And she kept saying his name, Maimonides, 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 like I should have known. Important to know, roaming service in the US is really expensive, so my phone was turned off. But when I got back to the hotel, I looked Maimonides up and I was like, oh, the Rambam. See, I only knew him by his Hebrew acronym because I had learned about him in the synagogue. But my mom did not grow up with religion at all, so she only knew him as Maimonides through, taking a philosophy class as an adult. I think this series of videos, more than any other, has demonstrated how big of a problem naming conventions can be in Jewish history. Now, Gaon-level patron Neve Tal asks, how connected were the Chinese Jews to the rest of the Jewish world that the writings of a Sephardic man from Egypt could catch on so quickly in such a relatively remote and geographically isolated land? Did they just bring the Mishneh Torah with them when they first arrived, or did it somehow find its way over there later? So, the history of Jews in China is something that I plan to eventually cover. I can't just yet, but I wanted to at least raise awareness that there was a Jewish community in China at this time by mentioning them offhand in the video. And in explaining further, I'll try to keep this brief. The short answer is that China's Jewish community wasn't isolated. Not at all. Not during this period. Although there are legends that suggest a much earlier time frame, the earliest credible evidence of a permanent Jewish community in China, which was in Kaifeng, was under the Song dynasty, which fell in the north only about a decade before Maimonides was born. And the first synagogues that we know of in Kaifeng were built in 1163, very shortly before the heyday of Maimonides. So this was not like Ethiopia. This community was fully in touch with the Jewish world at that time, close contacts to Bukhara and Iran, and only during the Ming dynasty did they gradually start to assimilate and start to fall into obscurity. However, in 1980, a historian named Michael Pollack, who specialized in Kaifeng Jews, wrote that what little did survive of the Kaifeng Jewish minhag by that time was completely Maimonidean in character, so there's every indication that, especially as relatively new arrivals in China, Kaifeng Jews absolutely fit the profile for early adoption of the Mishneh Torah. Dumb correction, the Nasi of the Great Sanhedrin was Yehoshua ben Perachia, not Yehuda. I'd even mentioned him under the right name in earlier videos, so he was a Jesus too. So many people, in the comments and on Patreon, wanted to know why there was no significant Jewish migration to Palestine under the Mamluks, because even if that migration had been purely religiously motivated, you'd expect there to be a decent inflow of Jews from elsewhere. I don't want to address this directly because it'll be covered in the next video, but the short answer is that almost as soon as the Crusades were over, the fortunes of the Jewish community fell, and ultimately the Mamluk regime ended up treating Jews very similarly to how they were being treated in Christian Europe. There was at least one major attempt at an Aliyah movement. In the 1280s, a rabbi named Meir of Rothenburg, the Maharam, attempted to flee the Holy Roman Empire with his followers and resettle in Palestine, but was kidnapped by a local nobleman and held for ransom. The ransom was raised, but Meir actually refused to accept it because that would encourage other nobles to start kidnapping rabbis. So he died in prison, and that was just about the end of it. Gaon-level patron Steve Morano asks, how were Jews in the Holy Roman Empire treated after the breakup into smaller principalities? Well, you watched the video. They were almost wiped out during the Black Death. But it's also very obvious that that wasn't the end of it, because there were ultimately large numbers of Ashkenazi Jews in Western Europe again by the end of the Rishonic period. So, about a generation after the plague massacres, some German states began changing their laws to allow Jews to own land in the hopes of getting them back from Poland. And ultimately, most of the Jews who had fled to Poland, or at least their children or grandchildren, ended up moving back to Germany. Now, this was not the case across the board. Over the whole 15th and early 16th centuries, many states, Austria, Bavaria, Passau, Nuremberg, expelled their Jews. But these were just a few of hundreds of states across a small area, so there wasn't the kind of massive refugee crisis that we saw in Spain. And not just because Ashkenazim were far fewer in number at the time. So one thing that really fascinated me, but where there really wasn't a place for it in the video, when King Alfonso XI died from the Black Death, the civil war broke out between his legitimate 16-year-old son, Pedro, and his illegitimate 16-year-old son, Enrique. But it turns out that Alfonso also left another illegitimate 16-year-old son by a third mother named Federico Alfonso. Now, he ended up siding with Enrique during the Civil War, and he was ultimately caught and killed by Pedro. However, by that time, Federico Alfonso had had an illegitimate son of his own named Alfonso Enriquez, whom Pedro kind of adopted and tried to keep secret from Enrique for the remainder of the war, but he eventually survived and was welcomed back into the fold of the royal court after Enrique won. Now, there have been conflicting accounts as to the identity of Alfonso Enriquez's mother. And I say conflicting accounts in the loosest sense, because later biographical accounts of him by his descendants don't bring up the identity of his mother at all, while contemporary accounts by people at the time who knew him very openly state that his mother was a Jewish woman named Paloma, who is probably known in Hebrew as Yonati ibn Yahya, and that she was not a converso. She was openly Jewish, and these are the only accounts about who his mother was. So it seems pretty clear to me that his Jewish parentage was something that was known at the time, but which his descendants really wanted people to forget about. And one reason why they might have wanted to obfuscate like that is because one of those descendants was King Ferdinand, for which reason most, if not all, of the royal houses of Europe today can be traced to this Jewish woman Paloma, which is just exactly what the European powers in Torquemada were afraid of, and I thought that was kind of neat. So I need to make a correction. When it comes to tracing Jewish demographics, it gets very confusing, and I got a little confused. In the video, I said that 200,000 Jews fled Spain, while 200,000 chose baptism. And that isn't technically correct, though I do think it was an easy mistake to make. Altogether, when the dust cleared, 200,000 Jews who had been in Iberia at the start of 1492 were living somewhere else, mostly in the Ottoman Empire, plus a few thousand more who'd been expelled from southern Italy under Spanish rule, while 200,000 had converted. However, about half of those 200,000 who converted were the same people who fled into Portugal, in order to secure a diplomatic marriage with one of Isabel's daughters. The King of Portugal ordered the refugees there to leave or convert, but almost immediately changed his mind and forcibly converted them all. Very few escaped. This is really important to understanding the next couple centuries of Jewish history, because the Jews who chose to convert had made their choice. The Jewish community at large had no sympathy for them because of that, and very few of their descendants ever reverted to Judaism. But in Portugal, that was not the case. These were people who had chosen to leave and had been coerced. There was great sympathy for them. And for a solid century and a half, Jews just kept coming out of Portugal. To India, to the Ottoman Empire, especially to Northern Europe once the Protestant Reformation started, and most of all the Netherlands. And that changed everything. Because these were people who had missed the whole deep dive into mysticism that had come out of the despair of the Jewish community after the expulsion. And not having been part of that kind of mania, the Portuguese Jews would ultimately reject most of that stuff and really change what it meant to be Jewish in the history of the world. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, not all Portuguese conversos, or cristãos novos, reverted to Judaism or escaped. A great many of them were resettled on these sort of island colonies, most especially the Azores, which is where most of the Portuguese diaspora worldwide comes from today. Well, as it happens, in the late 1970s, my mom dated an Azorean immigrant to the United States, and at some point or another had dinner with his family, and as the dinner was being prepared, my mom went into the kitchen, She was very interested in cooking from a young age, really part of that era of boomers who figured out the idea to make American food taste good. And she saw her boyfriend's mother koshering the chicken. That's the Jewish practice of using salt to sort of very quickly drain the blood out of the animal to keep it kosher. So after seeing this, she says to her boyfriend, "Your mom is koshering the chicken. That's a thing Jews do when they prepare chicken. I think you used to be Jewish." So he asked his mom about this in Portuguese because she didn't speak English very well. And she said something back to him, and he translated to my mom what she said, which was, "Maybe we were, but thank God we aren't anymore." Many years later, when I was a baby, my family went to Joe's, that's his name, to Joe's for dinner while we happened to be in Boston on a Friday night, and my bubby, Zichronah Levracha, noticed Joe's mom lighting candles and covering her eyes while she was doing it. And she didn't say anything, and my bubby told my mom, "She's doing what the women do when they light candles, but they don't say the blessing." And my bubby was an atheist, and her parents were atheists, but she knew this from her bubby. And finally, many years after that, they did find out that they were of Jewish descent. So, in discussing the expulsion of Jews in the Alhambra Decree, a lot of people want to know what happened to the Muslims in the Alhambra Decree. And weirdly enough, the Alhambra Decree did not apply to Muslims. And for the remainder of the 1490s, Muslims remained the majority in the former Kingdom of Granada without issue. In 1499, the Archbishop of Toledo began imprisoning Muslim community leaders and forcing them to convert. And this led to a 2-year insurgency in the mountains around Granada, the Alpujarras, and that ended with the Muslims being forced to convert. For many decades, most of them continued to practice Islam in secret, but about 70 years later, they came out of hiding, there was another rebellion, and that ended with all the open Muslims being deported and the region being resettled by Christians from the north. And that is the era of the Rishonim. Thank you for joining me to explore a little understood and often misunderstood period of Jewish history. I'm going to take a little break, and I'll be back with you in a little while as we cover 200 years of fallout from the expulsion and all the genius and madness that came out of that. Special thanks to my patrons, especially my Nevi'im, Eric Atreides, Jeremy Biskind, Osher Gordon, and James Majors, and I will see you next time.